Before we get started, I'd also like to note that Senator Mary Margaret Whipple has joined us. She had a great column in Arl Now last week, kicking off Affordable Housing Month, and we are so happy you're here and you're continuing work for housing in our community. It's really great. Now that you've heard the big overview, we're going to really start to talk about missing middle in Arlington. And take a finer, more local view of what's going on here. We've got three gentlemen who served several different capacities. Bob Brosnan was the former director of planning and now with Catholic University. We've got Erik Gutshall, who is vice chair of our planning commission and owns Clarendon Home Services. And then we have Scott Matties, who's an architect with Cunningham Quill Architecture here in the region in Alexandria. So we're so happy to have them here with multiple hats. We're just going to dive right in and talk a little bit about the history of missing middle. So if you gentlemen could just give us a little bit of an overview of what we already know and have built, and how did it come about here in Arlington?
I think I'm the dull pencil on the group, so. I mean, you know, Arlington's zoning history, and I've dealt with it for 38 years, that's why I call myself the dull pencil. You know, we've grown as we've been zoned as a fairly traditional suburban community. So what we have is 75%, 75% single family zone. We've got commercial along the major, not transit corridors, but the secondary transit corridors, Lee Highway, Glebe Road, places like that. And then we had the commercial in the two metro corridors, which, as you know, we up-planned and up-zoned to get what Daniel said was, you know how to do the tall stuff. So we've evolved pretty much like many suburban jurisdictions. I think now this conversation really needs to be about how to deal with the one piece that we may have more of than many places, which is our medium density stuff, which is the garden apartments. To me, that's where our largest opportunity rests, and we can talk a little bit about that later. And then secondarily, along those commercial corridors. I don't think we've treated our commercial corridors fair. And every time I drive down Glebe Road or the highway and see single family houses fronting on them, I wonder to myself, is this the best place? Is this the best use along these? And I guess there's a third one that I would put in, which is the edges. And Daniel showed that a little bit, but we have a lot of areas where we have transitions from commercial, either high density or in some cases not so high density, to single family. And I know there are some in the community who have, Martha Moore being one of them, who have looked at those areas and said, you know, maybe there's a better protection we can put in place and transition to the neighborhoods. We've paid attention to that in the high density corridors, I'd say. And then I guess the last one I was going to put in is an opportunity, which we can talk more about, was, and Daniel talked about, the form-based code actually allows us to do a lot of different things already in Columbia Pike. Maybe we want to consider that in some other areas, but I think Columbia Pike might be a good testing zone, if you will, for what is allowed and what isn't allowed and what might we modify to allow it.
You know, I came to the Planning Commission by way of my work through my civic association here in the corridor in Lyon Park. I've been living there for 21 years now. And I think, you know, as far as how we got to where we are and along the way, from my own perspective and our neighborhood, it seems as though, you know, going back 21 years when we first moved to the neighborhood, and as housing prices were, and housing prices, of course, had been going up even prior to that in the corridor with Metro coming. But it seemed like everybody was fine with that, right? Hey, our property values are going up. This is great. We're getting, you know, these amenities in the corridor. We're creating these walkable neighborhoods. It's all great. But somewhere along the way, and I think there's an interesting connection here between the missing middle and the tear-down phenomenon that's happening in single-family neighborhoods. Somewhere along the way, and it has to do with the economics and what does the market want in these housing values, I think that there's a recognition that the very character of our neighborhoods is at risk, is at stake, because there is no such thing as the status quo. It's not, you know, will the market, the last slide there was, you know, the market is waiting. To me, the reality is the market doesn't wait. The question is whether or not we're going to grab this by the horns. I think this is an exciting conversation because we have the opportunity to define where are we going to go, what's going to happen, what are our neighborhoods going to be, and how do we respond to the realities, because the pressure is so great that we've got to come up with new things. And I think that there's a real thirst as people are looking to age in the community, as people are asking themselves, will my kids be able to live in Arlington and have the life that we have had in Arlington? Those are important, critical questions.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that. I think it is largely an economic puzzle to solve. I mean, there's a design component, of course, and I agree with what Bob's saying is that in our experience doing projects in Arlington, the transitions is where the most anxiety tends to happen. We do know kind of how to do the big projects, and the single-family neighborhoods tend to take care of themselves. But that transition, and there's a lot of transition zones between the high-density corridors and the low-density single-family, and we've done that on a number of projects. That's really where sort of the most community anxiety in our experience happens in terms of size and scale and what have you. So the design really does matter. I think it matters primarily on the urban design. It's kind of a tiered mattering. The urban design really matters. I mean, Daniel's examples of, I think it was a great example of the courtyard condition that nobody knew was so dense, right? As compared to the really terrible examples, which I think we can all agree are really terrible examples. But I think when you look at it from a design perspective, we have this conversation in the community a lot, is I think the urban design matters the most, and we have to kind of, to an extent, divorce that from the aesthetic. Divorce style from urban design a little bit, because we need to have a little more variety in terms of the aesthetic style of the actual architecture, but the urban design creating the place is a sort of a paramount importance, and we see that in these transitional zones and transitional neighborhoods all the time.
So when you walk in some of our traditional neighborhoods, especially around here, there's duplexes and triplexes born during the building of the Pentagon. So they're already in our neighborhoods. Talk to us a little bit, and this is a wonky crowd, so you can go into zoning code and stuff like that. If someone wanted to start building missing middle today, where is it allowed right now?
And I'm sure there's people in the audience who disagree with me if I state this wrong, but we don't have much duplex zoning in Arlington. R27 is a small amount of R27, and some of it was in Lyon Park, some of it's along Glebe Road, some's at Glebe Road and the highway. I forget exactly where else. There wasn't much of that, but you could build there. Again, I said this in the beginning, the biggest opportunity I think is in the RA districts. What our RA districts, what's happening today is our RA districts are all the garden apartments. They range from 14 units an acre to 72 units an acre. And we'll talk about density later, but so those would allow a wide array of things to happen. What's happening with most of those is they are our primary source of affordable rental housing, so it's not like we want to bring about a policy to get rid of those. On the other hand, when they are displaced, what they're typically displaced by is market rate townhouses, which don't provide any level of affordability. And so I think to enhance the opportunities for using the RA districts, and if you looked at one of our zoning maps, they're all over the place. They're on transit corridors, they're on bus corridors. One of the things that I had always hoped to achieve, and I know there's others that are along with me, is remove that townhouse by right in RA so that there's an equal level of competition, and who knows how the market might respond to that. I think that's a prime area. And the other two are the form-based code, as I mentioned. I know Jen's here, and she's more familiar with the form-based code, as it's applied than I, but I don't think there's anything in the form-based code that would prohibit a lot of flexibility in what fits behind the walls, if you will. I mean, the whole idea of the form-based code is that it fits on the site, has a relationship to a street in a certain way, but it doesn't dictate what's inside the walls. And so I think that provides an opportunity. And the last one, in our commercial corridors, we do allow residential in this, we call it UCMUD, Unified Commercial Mixed Use. It's been used very successfully in Nauk, where 2 affordable housing projects were built using it. It hasn't been built yet anywhere else in the county. 2 or 3 of them were approved, and I know Barnes Lawson's here, and he was involved in 1 or 2 of those approvals. A, they were very expensive to get through the discretionary review process. B, they required too much parking. They couldn't afford to build them since most of our commercial corridors are narrow depth, so it's very hard to fit in the parking. And 3, we had a requirement, because this grew out of a concern about townhouses displacing commercial. So we had a requirement that more than 1 floor of the development be commercial. And so that's not what the market has been. The market desire actually has been for those to be residential. So I think there's an opportunity there for small size units on bus corridors if we could, tweak it some to reduce parking and allow more flexibility in terms of how many residential units.
Yeah, I think that, just to latch onto that, I think, the nature of the corridor is important because, we have transit and density generally go hand in hand, right? And we have to realize that we have the metro corridors here, and those are obviously the most dense, but we have a lot of bus corridors. We have the ART bus, we have the WMATA bus, and, that is a form of transit as well, of course, and this whole notion of parking, which is, that's a big deal in most jurisdictions, and it really does drive the economics of these kind of small projects. That's a really important debate to have, and we've done projects along the Columbia Pike corridor in the form-based code, and you're exactly right. It's sort of a fairly substantial upzoning when you think about that along that corridor. Not appropriate everywhere, of course, but it is really about the form and whether we build the box to use break it down into a simple form, but whether we put in 83 units or 105 units is not relevant, except you still got to park that. I mean, that's the intersection between those two.
That's the relevance.
That's the problem, right? So, the box, the form that you build has to relate to more than just the form. There are other factors that are important in that calculation. I
think that's, you can see that really evidently in Westover, right? We've had existing middle housing that is being torn down and replaced with luxury townhomes. And that shows that while in a technical way you could say, well, what's allowed there? Yes, you could say some missing middle, but because of the economics of the parking and the setback requirements and the more suburban style zoning that exists there, that's not what the market wants right now. So what's available right now is the luxury townhome. So that's what the property owners are, that's the highest and best use, so that's what they're going to go to. So our challenge is to figure out a way, how do we provide a zoning tool that creates more options to the property owners other than just tearing those down and replacing them with luxury. And I did want to say real quick, Bob, that when we talk about the edges and the transition, so actually there is an UCMUD that's coming up out of the ground here on 10th Street. But that was such a huge parcel that would not have been viable if it wasn't such a large parcel. And it's going to be it's a fairly, a big building, so not exactly what we're talking about in terms of missing middle. But the real answer is to me is what can we do right now? Obviously not enough. That's why it's missing. And I think you look at these weird triangle parcels, these sort of out parcels, small lots, when you don't have, we need to figure out how to allow for and encourage development on a much smaller scale that doesn't require full block consolidation, and that can make use of again, these triangle lots and these weird little out parcels that right now, just think of anywhere along our corridor where you see a used car lot. That's sitting there as a used car lot because the zoning tool is not there to allow an investment in that property.
The other thing I wanted to mention about, because Westover brought this back to my mind, is the competition within those RA districts. And you're right, it's the luxury townhouses right now. One of the other things that I think could be done, and we've always been interested in doing, was, and Daniel spoke against density, but units per acre works against you when you're trying to create more flexibility. So one of the things we could and should probably do in the RA districts, and we've long considered this, is not go full form-based code, but go an FAR, where you can control the heights and basically the bulk of the building to a certain degree, yet not force developers into building multi-bedroom. I know we need multi-bedroom units, but multi-bedroom units are more costly. They make more money on them. Whereas if it's FAR and they can do more units, they might tend to do more units. Again, it's going to come back to, however, can you fit the parking on there? And so you're going to have to deal with the parking. You don't want to have them to go underground, so where are they going to park?
And FAR is floor area ratio. Even though I'm sure everybody could probably school us on that in this crowd, it is Arlington. Let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the barriers you've already touched on, and let's look at parking. And if you could talk a little bit about parking and different ways you think we can attack these barriers. What are they now, and where should we be going?
Well, I think the only way you can really attack it is to reduce it. And so that talks about, where is it appropriate to apply these? Most of our RA districts and the commercial corridors have good transit. They don't have buses. I mean, they don't have heavy rail, although the buses possibly are more reliable right now than the heavy rail. But places like Shirlington have survived quite well with no rail. It's all bus. And we have Art Bus, we've got regional bus service. So I think we got to look at that. I know that Arlington's starting to look at the residential parking requirements. It was something that was resisted for a long time. We looked at office. But I just think you're going to have to, it's not so much fitting it on site creatively, although that might be looking at what our parking physical standards are, might be one thing, but I think it's looking at reducing them. And when we first put 1530T in place, you used to get 30 units an acre when we required one space per unit. When we upped it to, I think we upped it to 2 spaces a unit, it dropped to 18 to 20 units an acre. So it just showed, it almost cut it in half, the density you could get in Ballston. And actually the early Ballston units were smaller and more of them, obviously. Once they were cut in half in density, they became larger. So I think parking really, besides the economic thing that Daniel talked about, it really does physically affect the site. So I think you have to look at cutting them out.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with that, but it's looking at how buildings are parked in general from a design perspective. There's kind of maybe to have some more variability, and I mean, because nobody wants to see the parking as part of the problem. So to the extent the parking rate doesn't change, it all wants to be below grade, because that's sort of, that promotes the walkable community that we're all, aspire to. But having some, nexus between, allowing some parking to be visible, but not all. Maybe it's pushed to the back of the site, and the form-based code addresses that, at least on Columbia Pike. But all the examples that Daniel has shown, I think is appropriate, is those are all small-scale projects that are surface parked. We've done some projects that look at sort of embedded parking, but surface parking, for these scale of projects is really where it needs to be economically. And as the projects grow a bit, there has to be a recalibration of not only the amount of parking, but how the parking is accomplished. And we can kind of come together on that as a community, so that to be able to see a car isn't the worst thing in the world.
I think that the good news is we've come a long, long way in a relatively short amount of period of time. The first site plan project that I got involved with here in Clarendon, the conversation, that was nearly 20 years ago, the conversation at that time, and in particular from some of the neighbors' concerns, was really geared towards, we've got to have, and even the county's attitude, staff's attitude, was still, the paradigm at that point was, you got to have a minimum amount of parking, and that's sacrosanct, and that's the way it has to be. And you had in particular, and I think it shows where the market has gone, I remember hearing from applicants, developers saying, well, we can't get financing for this building unless we have X amount of parking. And that pendulum has swung completely the other way, where now financing is not a problem because the capital markets, the money, has figured out that that people don't need as much parking as they did, and that the market will kind of take care of it, and that developers know whether a unit is they're going to be able to sell units based on a certain amount of parking. And I think from the discussion, and it's neighborhoods and communities are not monolithic, believe me, There's plenty of room for discussion about what's the right amount of parking, what's the role of street parking, and what is the sense of entitlement or the realistic expectation that a single-family homeowner should have, that they ought to be able to park right in front of their house. Those conversations are always going to go, but when you look at where we've been and where we're going, and the fact that we have an entire generation now of young people who don't even really want to don't even care if they get their driver's license. I know on our street, all the teens, there's big conversations going on, and parents, saying, no, you've got to get your driver's license. And that's a completely new paradigm, right? That did not exist, certainly when I was a kid. And so the community is growing and evolving, and we as a community are growing and evolving and are making walkable places. And I think it opens up huge new possibilities for us.
Well, we live in an era of data and big data. So are there ways, as we look towards these solutions, to use data to make the case to neighborhoods, to developers, to ourselves even? What are the different metrics you think we should be looking at?
I think we ought to be looking at, in particular, in neighborhoods in the edge, on the edges of the corridors, and not just our heavy rail corridors, but on our major bus corridors, like Columbia Pike, doing more parking counts. Sort of, we do a lot of counting when there is a request for an application for our residential permit parking program. We have these warrants, and we go out and do those countings. But those are hot spots that have been identified as trouble areas. I think that if we were doing more routine, continuous counts of the true availability of parking spaces, not just what's, how full are our garages, and I know we do those surveys. I don't know that data is pushed out a whole heck of a lot. But also looking at our street parking and looking at the totality of how much infrastructure are we investing towards parking and what's the utilization rate. I think a lot of times people are surprised. And it's not necessarily is parking available. It's the knowledge of and the access to it. It's wayfinding. It's all of these things. And I know the restaurant owners here in Clarendon, this is a perennial issue, right? And it's never really, is parking available right out front on a Friday night? No, of course not. But parking is available within a reasonable walk, but it gets to sort of the psychology of it, and our people, people feel this sense among some that, that you want to drive right up and park right out front. And that's not a reality here, but the reality is that there is parking available, and making sure that people know that.
So in addition to parking, what are some of the other barriers that we need to pay closer attention to?
I think one is process.
Yeah.
We talked about that earlier, especially on these small infill ones. I mean, you mentioned Yucmud, which I had forgotten about, but that also took a long process. We've got to make it simple. The theory of form-based codes was that you would put a plan in place and then they'd be followed and be administrative. Now that puts a lot of pressure on the staff, I understand, to be the ones responsible for making sure you get it right. But I think the time and expense that's involved in going through an extended process for these smaller infill projects kind of just makes it much tougher to do. Yeah. Personally, I think that you do the planning and the conversation up front to put the tool in place, and then you should let the process, that could be the typical Arlington process. Everybody could be involved and we can have the conversation, but once we agree on something, it ought to be as easy as possible to move it forward. That's the best economic development strategy I think there is. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree completely. I mean, the projects that we've done, and we've been doing these sort of small-scale projects for 15, I just didn't know there was a name for it. But we've been doing these kind of projects for a while, and the economics of those projects they're by right economics. I mean, those small-scale projects can't really support the soft cost or the development cost of our 4.1 process, or even an UCMUD process. They're just not there. And I think, Arlington, I'm an Arlingtonian as well. I lived here a little more than 20 years. We look at our community, there's the Arlington way, and it's a love-hate relationship, depending on which side of the fence you're on, of course, but it is the way we do things in our community. And I think, to have you know, a different process, or to sort of allow a letting go to a certain extent, to allow this kind of project type to be able to flourish. I think it's part of the mindset that we have to kind of develop here in Arlington.
Are there other processes other than just the approval process that sometimes get in the way of doing some of these middle scale projects?
I'm
Well-
not an expert, so.
Well, I would just, one thing, you know, our company is based in Washington, and, you know, Washington DC has gone through a complete rewriting of their zoning, and that is now active, and that was a years-long process. And one thing they're also currently revamping is their inclusionary zoning provision. And over the last, 7, 8, 10 years, when inclusionary zoning in the district first came online, in an attempt to get more affordable units actually built by new development projects, they set a threshold at, you know, the 10th newly constructed unit kicks in the IZ requirement. And over the last 8 or 10 years, we've seen a lot of 9-unit projects. And that's sort of how the market adapts. And the 9-unit, we saw a lot of missing middle projects come our way, in part in the district, in part because of that. And, you know, the notion of affordability, you know, middle scale and middle income don't always equate. So we just have to be aware of that. And we need to the extent we want them to equate, and I think it's appropriate that they equate, there's a little more work behind the scenes to help make that happen from that perspective. And I think there are regulatory tools that can promote that, but we just have to understand that there can be some unintended consequences. And I know through the Columbia Pike process, that has sort of been a continual work in progress. There have, you know, it came out in 2003 or 2005, the first iteration of the commercial nodes code. And it has been kind of a continual process of tweaking and updating, and I think that's appropriate.
I think that it's important to understand that when we talk about process, there's actually, the county has within its control really 2 processes. One is the pre-approval and the other is the post-approval. And there's pre-approval, your land use approvals, right? Zoning approvals. But then there's the building permit approval. And both of those processes, I think, still have, there's been a lot of talk about that, and there's still a lot of room for improvement. It's kind of a running joke right now among home builders in the county in terms of, just for example, of what is the measurement? What do you measure to when you're determining whether you comply with setbacks? It used to be a foundation wall, and then it was an exterior wall. Now there's discussion of does it include the windowsill if your windowsill sticks out. So when you talk about, when everyone says, well, developers, they got this herd mentality and they build the same thing, they build cookie cutter homes and it's the same house over and over and over again. There's a reason why they do that, because then they know that they can get it built and they can get it done, and it's going to get approved because they've done it before. Because you try to do something new and different and innovate, and you're adding in the risk of a longer approval process, or God forbid you build something and somebody comes out and tells you it's an inch too close to the property line, and you've got a huge, you know, headache and hassle and expense on your mind. So we can work as a community, as a county, to make sure that we are controlling both sides of those, not just the land use approval, but also making sure that the building permit approval process, and especially as we start to look into innovating housing types, and making sure that we don't have developers, builders that actually want to do that are hitting roadblocks with getting building permit approvals because it's something that maybe plan reviewers haven't seen before. We can grease the skids.
Right. Okay. So now that we've all gotten our bête noires off our chest and we've complained, let's talk about aspirations, and let's talk about if we are successful in building more missing middle housing in Arlington, what are those opportunities, and where would you like to see the whole process and the design, and including in the Arlington way, everyone, how can we make that go forward?
Well, from the design perspective, you know, I've been doing, you know, these projects for years, as I mentioned. It's a really fun project type to design. It's, you know, our firm does everything from single-family homes to the big stuff that's along the corridors to you know, many-acre master plans. So we in our company we see that range, It's a really interesting project type to design because it has, it's a little bit bigger, can be a little bit bigger than a single family or a mansion apartment. The projects that we've contributed to the gallery are some of my favorites that I've done over my career in large measure because they have, and they're invariably in a context that's varied. All of them are in a kind of a varied or transitional context, and part of what's interesting about design from my perspective is responding. Design is inherently a responsive endeavor. It's responding to something, whether it's program or economics or context, and finding a way to respond appropriately to a context that's varied can be very interesting from a design perspective, and I think it can promote more interesting design. There's more opportunities there, so I think from that perspective it can help enrich the overall environment.
I think that we are just in such a fantastic place right now, both in time and history and geographically too. There are lots of communities that, and I'm sure, Dan, when you're consulting with all these communities, there's lots of places that are trying to figure out ways, well, how can we get some development to come here? How can we get something going? We've got a community here where everybody wants to be. We actually have a great problem to have, which we have tremendous pressure to produce to meet a demand that exists there. So that gives us lots of opportunities to leverage that, to do new things. We also have, I think, a great rich tradition. Arlington was the birthplace of the idea of a garden-style apartment, right? We innovated and created a new housing form that then swept the nation and defined, for many folks, I grew up in garden apartments, what it was to be, what kind of housing you're going to live in. We have the opportunity to define what is next. What is the next housing type? How are our kids and grandchildren, what are their houses going to be like? Where are they going to live? We have the opportunity to define that, and we have all of the foundation in place. We've got the market. We've got a progressive community that's willing to think. We've got the investment in the transportation infrastructure that makes walkable communities. We've got everything that we need right here. So to me, it's not if, it's just how are we going to do it, and how far are we going to be willing to push the envelope?
I think Lee Highway is a great place to kind of start. The conversation's already started in the community about wanting something different along Lee Highway, similar to what was done in Columbia Pike. There's a lot of underutilized commercial parcels. They face a lot of challenges in terms of depth and things like that. But I think that would be a great experiment ground because there's a lot of underutilization up there.
So in addition to the form-based codes, what are the other types of mechanisms we might be able to put in play? Zones, pilots? Talk a little bit about it, especially you, Erik, as someone who sits on these different commissions. What are those steps? What should we be working towards?
Well, I think Arlington will come up with the answer that is right for us, and exactly what that's going to be, I think needs to be a process to get there. But I think one of the things that we've got to look at is a way of doing this, through probably what will be some kind of overlay district. That doesn't necessarily take away the by right. So using the Westover example, it's not so much about removing the ability to build townhouses, it's about creating a different opportunity. And you can't dictate which way a property owner is going to go, but hopefully we create opportunities, and so property owners will go, and at least some of them would go in a different direction. And as you start to see that evolve, I think Lee Highway is a great example. If we look at, when I think of my own neighborhood, Lyon Park, and I think about the frontages on 10th Street and Washington Boulevard, certainly all along Glebe Road, our major corridors where there are opportunities. So we do some kind of overlay that opens up, and we definitely will have to have that conversation about if it's not necessarily form-based code the way that we've implemented it on Columbia Pike, but some way where the community still has confidence that we're going to get what we really want, but doesn't involve some kind of review process that is so expensive and so onerous that precludes anyone from doing it. So there's a conversation that's still that's just getting started.
Great.
This is where I can speak as an ex-county employee. because no one can, they can't get rid of me now. But I disagree with one thing Erik said. You know, we have taken things away before. We removed townhouses from commercial districts because there was a competition. I think zoning evolves over the years. You have to be very careful about it. There has to be a lot of good reasoning. I don't think any one of the county attorneys are here, so they'd have to be consulted with pretty carefully. I know we've done some thinking, done some work in the past on that, but I think, you know, you introduce things that give a competitive advantage or try to provide a competitive advantage, but I think you have to look at some of the underlying market things and decide whether that's right for your community. We introduced them to allow them. At some point you can, you know, looking at the careful process and the economics, you can remove things. So I think making equal footing is an important aspect to consider.
Excellent. Well, I think that wraps up our talking, and so now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle. We're going to do the Q&A and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Great panel. Thank you. I'd like to target this at Dan, who just sat down. So Dan, you're working on this across the country. It's been great to see what's happened on kind of identifying this as housing grouping, and I think a lot of people are saying, well, what's with this middle housing? You know, what does that really mean? Why are we calling it that? And I think you nailed it earlier with the idea of it takes away the scary aspect of what we're doing with it. But it's, you know, it evolves into other things we've been talking about for years. The question I have for you, and the reason is in your travels and in your developing of this and in your work, how have you found jurisdictions dealing with this parking issue? And I you know, if you don't have answers, that's fine, but this is the crux of a lot of this, of the housing we're finding on every project. I'm partner with Scott, Lee Quill of Cunningham Quill. So we're finding that parking is driving things in our projects that are not, they're not making them better. We're having to respond to regulatory requirements in areas that maybe don't need them, where they're more walkable, bus lines, transit, et cetera. Have you found anything nationally in your work or with your colleagues that might help inform this discussion here? Thank you.
I wish there was one magic solution, and I think the answer tends to be a little bit different in every community, but what we have found most effective was tying the cost implication, especially in a place like Arlington, where affordability is a big part of the conversation, of directly tying the cost implications of providing that additional parking to the cost of the unit, and sort of adding that to the dialogue. And then you can also, especially as architects, this is an easy thing to do, is actually show how much better a design can be without all of the parking, right? Because the parking typically drives the site plan or the urban design, and being able to show either historic examples as a starting point. That's why we do the walking tours as well, is because we do the documentation and show, hey, 8 of the 10 examples that we documented exist. They're highly sought after, and by the way, they, 6 of the 10 had no off-street parking. They parked on the street, and 2 of the other ones had 1 per unit. And so you can have the dialogue that way. And then you can actually pick a couple of prototypical sites and say, if we had to provide 2 per unit, this is what you're going to get. And if you took that down to 1, this is how it would be better. And if you took it down to 0.5, it would be even that much better from a design and placemaking standpoint. Another tool that we're using in the Bay Area now, it's a really great program that I encourage you to take a look at. It's been developed by, it's called Green Trip. It was developed by the staff at a nonprofit called Transform that I'm on the board of. And it enables developers, right? So the other thing that community members have a problem with is, you're giving the developer all this additional potential, just giving it away. And so what this program does is it gives the developer the ability to swap out off-street parking spaces for 50 years of transit passes for owners or renters, or we're going to put 2 car share pods on site and give the residents 30 years of membership, or we're going to do additional bike parking or provide them access to the bike share program, 30 years of transit passes. And the economics of it always make complete sense to the developer. Like, the developer's still saving some money. they're providing sort of that mobility choice directly, and the community can see that you're just not going to provide a project with no parking, and the cars will still arrive, and they're going to sort of infiltrate their neighborhood. So I'd say those are a few things to think about.
That's actually very similar to what we do with our site plan projects, where we have a transportation demand management plan where developers give memberships to car sharing services, metro fare, and et cetera. So the idea of doing that on a smaller scale is a very interesting concept.
Hi, Mary Hines, former county board member. So here's my question for you. I think you've properly focused in on parking and access to transit and density and how we think about all of that. I think the new sort of problem is what's the impact on schools? And so I think we shouldn't have our conversation here without acknowledging that we're going a little bit, Daniel, the opposite way of what you said. For years, school kids, 15% of households had a school kid in them here in Arlington. I think we're up to 18% now, and we're moving the other way. Our schools are crowded, and people are saying every time you build something new that's multifamily, you're multiplying the impact on schools. So my question is, when you're looking at what you're seeing nationally, what's a percentage of these missing middle houses that actually produce school-aged children? And secondly, is there any place where they're having a good conversation about the positive impacts of doing this from an education, school providing kind of cost point of view?
I guess I've never seen research that specifically ties missing middle housing to sort of the number of school-aged children, but if 75 to 85% of households don't have children, I mean, I think part of it is getting away from the direct correlation of apartments to a certain type of person or household, and the other. So I think I don't have a great answer, I guess, as part of it, but just as an example, I would say typically a lot of the pre-1940s neighborhoods that we've documented across the country have 15 to 20% of the housing stock is missing middle. What we're seeing in a lot of places, including the neighborhood that I live in, Berkeley, which probably has about 20% missing middle, is that there are now more millennials than boomers living in our cities, and as those millennials are aging, they're having some kids, and there are some additional demands to the schools, but there's not been any really specific documentation done in relating missing middle to sort of school-aged children and the demand on schools, I would say.
Carrie Johnson, Free Radical. Thank you. Former planning commissioner, for those who don't already know me. I want to commend the panel for highlighting the fact that we historically have been among the leaders in middle density housing in terms of garden apartments and the historic townhouse complexes like Fairlington. And our problem has been that the major leverage under Virginia state law that we've had for trying to conserve that has been historic preservation ordinances. And that obviously has had some successes, but a whole lot of problems. So we do need to figure out what other tools we can find within the confines of what the Commonwealth lets us do. But I want to put I won't editorialize about Fort Myers Heights North, except if anybody wants to talk about it, I'd be happy to. But let me put a different question to the panel now. One of the areas where we have an awful lot of excess density is in McMansions. And many people have talked in the abstract about the possibility of subdividing within those buildings to create additional units of various sorts. I know some places where it's been done, particularly with a lot of older, large homes. I grew up in Milwaukee, and many of the lakeside mansions there are now condos with 4 and 5 units in them. But let me invite any of you who are willing to touch this hot potato to talk about the pros and cons of allowing additional units within existing single-family homes.
So I'll give the easy answer. Architecturally, no problem. Can be done. It's a bigger social question than an architectural question.
I'll give the zoning answer. It's very difficult to do.
I'll give the community answer, which is I think this is a discussion that people are ready for, and I don't think it can't be done lightly. I think it dovetails very nicely actually with the conversation about accessory dwelling units and the possibility of adding cottage-style units in the backyards of some of these homes. I think it also goes to one of the elements of implementation of our affordable housing master plan is a look at the definition of a family, right? Because I don't know that taking that larger format single-family home, that necessarily physically dividing it is the only way to get more density out of it, get more occupants in it. I think that there is the real possibility of making it easier. The example I love to use is if you have two single-family mom households and they wanted to combine resources and live together, say, well, you live upstairs, I'll live downstairs, we'll share the kitchen. And it's a form of co-housing, or cohabitation, however you want to define it. But right now, under our zoning ordinance, no more than 4 unrelated folks living together, assuming that those two single moms don't want to get married, there's no option available for them to do that. So it's not just about physical divisions, and I think it really has to do with having an honest discussion about what are people afraid of. Are people afraid of, well, this single-family home is going to be turned into a tenement, style house? And I think once you really start to have that conversation, I believe personally that there are more folks who are worried about being able to afford to stay in Arlington. There are more folks who are worried about will their kids be able to live here? Then there are people who are worried about that somehow our neighborhood is going to be, it's going to be the downfall of the neighborhood by letting more people in. And so it really is it's about mitigating. It gets back to parking again, because anytime you talk about more density in single family, it is always comes back to parking. So mitigating that and making sure that the conversation includes that, I think that we can get there. It is a discussion that has to happen.
And I'd like to add, unfortunately I took the 4 slides out of my presentation this morning because I wasn't sure if I wanted to touch that or not, but you're not the only place that's having this conversation. Of all places, so Palo Alto in California is like the single family home bastion, and missing middle was introduced into their vocabulary, and it's made tremendous progress in the community in talking about housing choice. The slides that I took out of my presentation, because I think that what the missing middle can potentially do, and what we've proposed in several communities is, right, the single family allowed building envelope tends to be really large. And a lot of times, most single family zoning districts, at least that we've seen, actually allow a 3rd story. And historically, nobody's built that 3rd story until the last 10 years, and then all of a sudden values are high and we start maxing it out. So there's a way that you can have a discussion with the community about sort of making a trade-off with that property owner of taking away some of that. Let's say they're going to, either the site's vacant or it's likely a tear down, that they can give away some of the height and some of that bulk, and the card that you give them is more units. But you just have to be really careful about where you allow that and how you regulate that, right? Because a great house scale 4-plex could fit on that 50-foot wide lot, but if you're not careful, you could get something pretty bad even if you by allowing 4 units. So you can get really fine-grained, and I think it's a really great conversation piece that you can tie back to that economic discussion as well.
Thanks for this great conversation. I think the missing middle housing is something, as been said before here, that it's emerging through, it's a conversation that's emerging throughout the country. But in order for missing middle to work, there's got to be a lot of other intersections with other community elements, including transportation and other elements. And one of the things that was touched on was walkability. And in order for walkability to work, there needs to be something to walk to. And Arlington has great walkable commercial corridors, but I think that there are a lot of neighborhoods in Arlington that have potential for missing middle housing, but don't have that great destination diversity for encouraging greater walkability. So If we're focusing on some of the intersections that would make missing middle housing work, have any of you seen examples of flexibility in zoning and building codes that would allow the small scale retail and commercial buildings viable to facilitate more walkable missing middle housing outside of the immediate and present commercial corridors?
One of the interesting things that I've seen, and I would not have expected it 10 years ago, is in places like Arlington, where it starts to transition to a more suburban pattern, that creative developers are taking early strip malls and converting them into those walkable neighborhood destinations, not in like tear down, build a complete new project, but more in like a tactical urban sort of incremental way where they're utilizing existing buildings, taking over parking lots and making outdoor dining. And the best examples of that are two very auto-dependent places, Austin, Texas, and even in Phoenix, Arizona. And so if they're doing that there, there's opportunity if you can remove some of the barriers that might be in place for some of that more incremental development that is necessary to seed the walkability. I think that's a really important part of the conversation. Thanks for bringing that up.
Real quick, I'm gonna sort of take a little different approach to your premise, I think, which is I believe that when you look at the map of Arlington County and you see where right now we have on our general land use plan, the GLUP, where we have provisions for medium density, which is primarily along all of our main commercial corridors, that there is for the foreseeable future, for right now, and in particular as we start to bite this apple and as we evolve and move forward, I actually think that there is ample opportunity and ample space available to us that is within walking distance of our commercial corridors. Now, is there something to walk to in all these commercial corridors? No, but the corridors are there, and it's a little bit of chicken and the egg. So when you provide the density that supports that smaller scale retail, I think we will see that retail will come in. So it's a little bit of chicken and egg, but I don't think we necessarily need to really be thinking about how are we going to provide walkable destinations, walkable retail, in far north 22207 up by Williamsburg, for example. I think that those R20 neighborhoods are going to stay R20 neighborhoods, and we've got more than enough opportunity that is adjacent, walkable to our commercial corridors.
So on that note,
we have one more question. Hi, I'm Catherine Scruggs, and I had been on the Affordable Housing Master Plan, and I'm a retired teacher in Arlington. I have been living here for 42 years, at a time when the missing middle wasn't missing. It was here, and on every block there was probably a policeman, a firefighter, a teacher, and now that is not the case at all. What can we do to try and bring those who serve our community be able to live here? Are there particular success stories around the country? And I'll just say that's what our whole next panel is about.
That was
Great
a
segue.
great transition.
Yes.
Thank you, Catherine, one of our board members. We had that planned. Thank you guys. Thank you very much. We're going to take a 10-minute break for changing over the panel here, and we're going to get started.